it's great to have a retrospective exhibition of your work in your hometown while you're still alive. Earlier this year, I got a message from a curator I didn't know, Marianne O'Kane, who you know, as you get a letter from somebody you don't know, and you glance down and you're scanning for sort of key words and phrases, and I saw the words major retrospective, and that sounded good, and then I saw the words this year, and I was ready to file it under N for Knitters when I saw the names Robinson McElwain and John Reid, and I knew John Reid wasn't a knitter, so I give Marianne the benefit of the doubt, and I'm delighted I did, because not only is she totally sane, but she's a very determined, dedicated young woman who has put this together in record time, got loans from major collections, and all without funding from the sources one would expect. I'll not mention any names, but the sources one would expect to fund an exhibition of this sort are noticeably absent from the credits. And you know, it was Marianne's faith and John and his partner's support that kept this going, and their faith that kept throughout the process. And I've said before that faith in a time of no funding is better than funding in a time of no faith. And we look forward to both in the future. Thank you very much for coming.
I first met this man, John Kyness, in 1966 in Barnegeha School at the folk classes there. We learned to play guitars and sing, "Ain't no use sitting wondering why, babe," and that kind of stuff, you know. And we met girls as well. Then we embarked on a voyage of exploration in a place called Salisbury Streets, which was just an ordinary house in a street, but in the back room, strange goings-on went on, and it was a place where the blues got kind of scrambled up with Irish reels and jigs and English shanties and chorus songs and stuff like that. So that experience of being, you know, aware of the various kind of influences that come into you from outside and from inside, that there is that idea that you can be those guys, that you don't have to be who you are, Protestant or Catholic or this or that you can exchange yourself for heroes, you know, of some kind.
John's work's very important to Belfast because he comes from Belfast originally. He hadn't had an exhibition in the city for 15 years, so it was very important to bring home the work to the people. A 20-year retrospective, he was celebrating 20 years as a practicing artist, and from my experience before, I had organised a Deborah Brown a Cast in Nature exhibition at the Waterfront Hall to complement Sheep on the Road Outside. So there was a similar vein here that we were complementing the Big Fish and his other public pieces in the city with a 20-year retrospective in the switch room, within a stone's throw of the city. So it was just the perfect exhibition for a 7,000 square foot space that's been provided by Robinson McElwain. So you have that feeling of just an opportunity not to be missed, but you need a major name, you need an established artist who's a major player to really hold a space like this and bring it into its own. Every exhibition you need to be determined and dedicated and passionate about both the artist, the work and the venue. Now all those ingredients were there, but it took major personal commitment. If you're putting together any retrospective for a museum or a gallery, you need a 2-year lead-in period. To be giving it a 6-month lead-in period and fast-tracking it like that is probably quite, it's a bit of a gamble. So essentially what I did when I approached John in March was said to him, is this something that you think you can do? And he said, well, you have the vision and I know John Reid well, so I would be interested in rising to the challenge, but you're going to need to do a lot of work. And he gave me that challenge early on, so I knew exactly what I was getting into. If we had had a number of touring venues to send John's exhibition to, everybody piggybacks on the funding, and they all work together in terms of production of catalogues and so on. That level wasn't there, and I suppose that was the major difficulty in the whole thing. We were both dedicated, John Kindness and I, but it did have that obstacle. So essentially what we did was we had to pare back a lot of elements, and we had to just use the switch room as the ultimate destination for the exhibition. And really all the shortfall in funding was met by the architects themselves. They put all their personal practice money into it to meet that obstacle. It was remarkable how thirsty people were for his work. To have an artist talk in the city attended by about 150 people is pretty much unprecedented even for festival times. The openings get the crowds, but the talks, that really thrilled me to see so many people thirsty for his work. A lot of the work hasn't been shown here before in Belfast, so that's fantastic. The people of Belfast, where John's actually from, get to see the work firsthand and enjoy it, and they get to see the process and some of the mosaic pieces that they can identify with the fish and the Children's Hospital, and the museum of the old lady who swallowed a fly is here as well. My favourite, or the piece that would stand out for me most, or whatever way you want to put it, would probably be the sectarian armour from the Imperial War Museum. It was such a feat to get that piece here from an institution like that and to secure that loan, and that was John's. He felt that was the main triumph that I did in the exhibition, and the piece itself is so exquisite that it just gave, a piece from 1994 with such power. It just moves you to look at it and to view it in the round, so it was really worthwhile.
John, I'd like to take you right back to growing up, but more particularly the influence your parents had.
It's well documented in a series called the Belfast Frescoes, and that was actually a great aid to my memory. When I was working on those, I remembered things I didn't know I remembered. I grew up in North Belfast, overlooking the waterworks. We lived in the ground floor flat in 18 Brookville Avenue, and you could see the Cave Hill looking across the pond. It was a great paradise for kids. This quiet period of time. It was quite a posh area, or genteel maybe is the better word. A lot of old ladies living around us. My dad worked in the shipyard, and my mother didn't work when we were young. She didn't go to work until my youngest brother went to start at school. So my mother was the big influence on us. She spent a lot of time with us, and she had a great knack of knowing what kids would like to do, places that she would take us that she knew we would enjoy. My dad was a sort of, the sort of classic absent father, like Robert Bly talks about that, about how industrialization separated fathers from their sons. He was out in the morning, I had no idea what he did. And in the frescoes, there's an image of this cigarette moving around, this disembodied glowing cigarette moving around in the dark, and that was him getting ready to go out to work. And then we didn't see him again until the evening. But he would come home with things like the shavings of the metal embedded into the soles of his boots. He had maybe skelfs, as he called them, in his hands. My mother used to take out a wee bit of metal out of his finger, quite often. Handkerchiefs with rust spots on them. Just little clues as to this heavy metal environment that he inhabited. He was a driller. And I didn't ever see a shipyard until I was at secondary school, and our woodwork teacher took us down to see a launch, as he called it. And that was the first insight I had into my father's world, into his workplace. My mother's family they were very interesting. They had been photographers. There were 3 generations of photographers. Lascelles was her maiden name, and my uncle still practiced as a photographer. My grandfather died when I was quite young. I have only vague memories of him, but he seems to have been quite a character. And he was a humanist, and he was anti-vivisection and anti-inoculation, and they were the kind of radicals of their time. I'm going to take you on a quick tour around the exhibition, and things are not exactly in chronological order, but I'll try and put some kind of order into it. A lot of you will know a large piece of sculpture in Belfast, and it's probably what I'm best known for, so we thought it was a nice idea to have some sculpture as you come in the door, and particularly some of its antecedents, some early ceramic mosaic pieces they're kind of miniature versions of that type of sculpture. They're like the fish, but just on a domestic scale. They're constructed in the same way, but with plaster and steel rods rather than concrete and heavy-duty steel welding. The construction of these creatures with skins of some other material other than animal skins actually started from a visit to the Ulster Museum to a big taxidermy show they had there quite a few years ago. And I watched an installation, a little audio-visual show of how a cheetah was stuffed by a taxidermist, and everything but the skin and the teeth were discarded, and the cheetah was built from scratch. The way a sculptor would work with an armature, reinforced plaster, building up the musculature, and then putting the skin back on again. And that's what started me making sculpture again. And I just thought, well, this could be, you can make any shape of creature, and you can put any kind of skin on it. It doesn't have to be an animal skin. Ninja Turtle Heart was made for an exhibition in Kilmainham Jail, and I took the symbol that you get on your letters from the government in Ireland, the symbol that really represents Ireland abroad, and infused it with this import of the American Ninja Turtles. Not a very reverent work, but it plays a great tune. We used to go on what we called a mystery tour, and you just walked out of your area, out of your neighborhood, until you got lost, and then you started to explore new areas. We used to go and fish for sticklebacks, used to build things, go up. If you went up out of the waterworks a bit, it got a bit wilder, and if we'd more time, we would have gone up the Cave Hill, lit fires, cooked sausages, and made bows and arrows. Sort of the half wildness that children in those days were able to enjoy. There were three of us. I was in the middle of three brothers, so we weren't exactly a tribe, but we did stuff together. And then I suppose when I was about 6 or 7, more kids started to come into that area. There were no kids in our block when I was very young, so more kids started coming around. And interestingly, I didn't realize this until much later, but the kids around my neighborhood were Catholic, and I went to a state school, which was by default a Protestant school. And we weren't brought up with any religion or any political ideology, and I was very naive about those things. But I think it was an election, which actually comes into the Belfast frescoes. There was an election which gave me a little bit of insight into the political process. And what didn't compute for me was how working class people were voting Unionist instead of Labour. But I began to work that out after a bit. But it was the naivety was such that I remember asking my mother why policemen carried guns, because I knew English police didn't. And she said, oh, it's in case a horse would be lamed and they would have to shoot it, because there were still quite a lot of horses doing deliveries and things at the time. And if she'd told me the awful truth, it couldn't have been worse than the thought of having, and I thought, I hope I'm never around when a horse breaks its leg, because these big Walther pistols, were just absolutely terrifying looking. Again, this has never been seen in Belfast, but is very relevant to the city and to a dark time in the city. It was painted in the 80s, I think, 86. I'm useless on even my own dates. This was happening a lot, where someone would ring a doorbell, the person who answered the door would be shot, or the victim would be sought out and killed, often in front of a family. It doesn't relate to any specific killing. It doesn't relate to any particular faction or either in aggressor or victim. But it's titled Night Canvas, spelt with 2 S's, and it was just a little play on the canvas, the canvassing around the doors for votes in the electoral process. And at a time when political parties were paying lip service to a democratic process, but were backing up their political campaign with threats of violence, hence the 2 characters you see on the wallpaper. And interestingly, we've come back to that polarity again, although as we speak, that is possibly changing. It's changed a lot since I lived in Belfast, and I look forward to that process going further. But it's in a tradition of assassination pictures where the assassins were mindless automatons and the victims were helpless, very humane people. And I just wanted to tweak that a bit and make the victim seem like a pretty aggressive kind of person, and the assassins look a bit sheepish about what they were doing, as I'm sure happens sometimes when the guy in the getaway car could be looking at what's going on behind him, or he could be confronting his conscience in his driving mirror. Later years in school were very important in that I had an art teacher called Jerry Hawthorne, who was a cut above the other teachers. In fact, he went on to become the headmaster of that school after I left, which is very unusual for an art teacher. And partly my father died when I was about 15, and Jerry kind of took me under his wing, and I could draw, and he noticed he was the first person really to notice that I had some kind of talent, and I dedicated that Treasures of New York exhibition to him, saying he took the first steps in turning a kid who could draw into an artist, because we were obliged to do things for our A-level art like plant drawing and figure drawing. But he would bring us in images of Albrecht Dürer's watercolors of plants and Leonardo and Michelangelo's anatomical drawings. So he was just showing us the best that was available. He was showing us the highest achievement in those areas rather than just something that you could get through and get your exam results out of. It's like all teenage boys love the surrealists. You love Salvador Dali and René Magritte. And I had the great treat of being able to go to London to see those things when I was about 15, 16. My brother lived there, and I would spend 3 or 4 weeks in the summer just devouring those collections of the Tate and National Gallery, British Museum. The Tate was really where it was at as far as I was concerned, because I was looking at the more radical artworks. But you could learn about them all learn about these movements from books in the Central Library, but seeing the actual work, I think is so important. I also loved, going back to Jerry Hawthorne's influence, I was able to look at the Leonardo cartoon, The Virgin of the Rocks, to see actual work of that standard and be able to breathe on it almost was tremendous at that young age. We formed ourselves into a group called Biceps, and we ran a club called Africa. And these names just came out of, didn't mean anything, they were just nonsensical names. And we were influenced by the surrealist group in Paris, and we just loved reading about the exploits these guys got up to and these performances they did. And we would do live performances, maybe involving painting, music, and poetry, little satirical sketches. It wasn't political, it was more like the kind of Footlights Review or that sort of fringe theatre of the time. So literature has always been in the background, and as I said, Joyce showed me this amazing way of just dealing with your medium. I mean, he used every aspect of the medium, from the vernacular language, advertising language, technical jargon, romantic novels, right through to that tour de force in the Auction of the Sun, where he goes through a little potted history of English literature to create the chapter of the book. This is a Shreddies packet, just abstracted to the degree that you can't actually read anything on it, yet you would know it's a serial packet. And when I was working on this, I would just catch an image of it out of the corner of my eye, And the real packet would be lying around as well. And just, if you didn't look at it directly and study it, you would mistake the two for each other. And there was behavioral biologist or something, or zoologist, who studied the effects of signals on animals, like where gull chicks, herring gull chicks were fed with, first of all, with a fake bird, then they were fed with a model or stuffed bird, model of the bird, and then just with a bit of stick splashed with yellow paint and red, and the rough markings of the bird, and the chick still went mad for it, even though it was reduced down to its basic components. And what interests me about these things is I believe that when creative effort is put into anything, it stays there, and we can't always extract it. We're inhibited by prejudices about something that is throwaway. Comics used to be considered a very low medium. Interestingly, Japanese prints, which we adore now in the West, were not at all favoured by connoisseurs in their own country. In fact, they came to Europe as wrapping paper for much more valuable porcelain. But when Westerners saw these things, they were amazed. So they were, you know, it's one that's sort of crossing a physical border to cross an aesthetic border. But I think you can cross that border just by just rethinking the way you look at things. And I mean, that's just another way of looking at serial packaging. This one is actually a painting based on a painting in the National Gallery of a Virgin at Prayer by Sassoferrato. And you can just about make out a sort of tilted head, shoulders, and praying hands. But it's hybridized with a packaging for Harpic toilet cleaning tablets. And I've used little things. They see fit on these packages to give you a diagram showing you how to put a tablet down your toilet. So I've turned that into a sort of demon around here. And the hazard symbol becomes crossed keys from the Vatican. Heracles and the Stymphalian birds, Odysseus and the sirens, Battle of the Gods and Giants. They're all classical subjects, but composed out of detritus, composed out of stuff that you would find on a fly tipping site or a rubbish dump. And as I said earlier, these are the things that fascinate me. I think you can tell a lot about a society by the things it values, but you can also tell a lot by the things it throws away. And archaeologists always look out for the dump. I started looking at attic vases when I was working on the Treasures of New York, because that inspired the images that are on those yellow taxi cab works. But it gave me, ever since that, I've had a real love for those images, and they're incredibly sophisticated in their compositions. And they also tell us a lot about the way the Greeks thought about the world. But I just wanted to articulate the images using the detritus from our society, and just sort of pushing it right back into 500 BC when some of these images were painted. The Battle of the Gods and Giants comes from the Pergamon frieze, which is now in Berlin, which it was excavated in Turkey in the 19th century, and practically a whole building, a whole frieze, was moved to Germany. I also was sort of thinking about modern day equivalents of some of the tasks of Heracles. He was sent to deal on this occasion with the Stymphalian birds that were menacing people, and I was trying to think of a modern equivalent of that, and I thought about maybe newspapers blowing around a rubbish tip that were like birds, a flock of birds rising. And then I thought about newspapers that were menacing people through their journalists or paparazzi or people from the press homing in on somebody and giving them a hard time. And these papers actually do all relate to the graphics of the papers that we have today. There are little subtleties in there that distinguish one paper from another. So I hope you'll be able to spend a bit of time with these images. There's a lot of detail in them. During my college years, during my last years at college, I started working on these things that would now be called graphic novels. I didn't know what they were called in those days, but just telling a story primarily through images rather than words. And I was also heavily influenced by Joyce. I'd read Ulysses in the first year, and I just thought, it just blew me away. And I thought, is there any way that this kind of technique, this kind of approach to literature could be applied to visual arts? And after a while, I got hooked up with, I think it was Alistair Hearn was really the prime mover on what became the Belfast People's Comic and Balloon Features Cartoon Syndicate. And there was myself, Ian Knox, who's now a professional cartoonist, Brian Moore, who's a professional cartoonist. Alistair was the sort of entrepreneur figure, or he pulled it all together. Various other people, Davy Francis made contributions, John Carson, Ian, I mentioned Ian Knox, Liam de Frenchie did a strip one time. So various people contributed to this, and it was just something that we printed with your small press. We sold it ourselves around the university, around Queen's, and we had it in a few of the bookshops in town. My contributions were. It was a satire on the Belfast hard man, like the sort of bucolic figure, Jimmy Ripshite, the man that ate the cooked ham raw. Then there was a strip about the formation of the Loyalist Navy, the three Billies, who bought the shipyard at a knockdown price and decided to create a Loyalist Navy, and went to sea to fight the Republicans, and ended up in combat with the Russian fleet. And we're victorious thanks to a lot of stale sodas and potato bread. I was particularly pleased that Marianne was able to borrow this from the Imperial War Museum, where it now resides, because it's never been shown in Belfast, but it's very much from this city, of this city. The denim jacket was the livery of the Belfast hard man when I was growing up, and often embellished with logos and symbols, crests relating to sectarian division, relating to the tribe the kid belonged to. And this involves symbols and devices from both traditions. On the front, they're the kind of the more expected ones: bulldogs, pigs, queens and virgins, crowns and harps. Around the back, it's a little more intimate and a bit more personal, and a bit more poignant. So I hope you'll have a chance to study the detail on that, because it was a great amount of trouble to get it here, to get it installed, and that's why it is in this case. Sometimes people ask my advice. Parents ask my advice on sending their kids to art school, and I say, well, you don't learn anything at art school anymore, but you've got to go there to find that out. If you don't go, you always feel you've sort of missed out on something. And I suppose the most important aspect of it is the social thing. And in those days, we not only didn't have to pay fees, we got grants that you could live on, which was a great luxury. And you imagine this was the start of a brave new world, but it was actually just a little window of opportunity that's now closed. I knew instinctively I didn't want to go into teaching. As I say, I didn't want to become a prison warder for the children. And I was looking around thinking, what can I earn a living from? And I started applying for jobs in graphic design, illustration, anything like that. Of course, nobody would employ me because I didn't actually have a graphics qualification. I had a fine art qualification. Until a guy called Cathal Caulfield, who had done some work for Kieran at the Arts Council. He had a wee graphics company up in the university area, and he took me on, and he looked at my portfolio and he said, look, if you can do this, you can do anything I'm going to throw at you. And somebody coming from an art college with a graphics degree, he says, it'd take me 6 months to knock all that out of them. So he took me on faith, and that was a good working relationship for a few years. And we would do things like, did a lot of design for print, and not hard sell advertising. We did stuff, the Arts Council were clients. We were doing posters for theatre and exhibitions. The television companies, Ulster TV, BBC were clients, so I got an insight into television graphics. in the pre-digital era. And just, you know, they were fairly pleasant jobs, some architectural stuff because the parent company did architectural plaster, so occasionally we got to do mosaic. That was my introduction to mosaic. It was usually just no more than a bit of decorative lettering, but it gave me a little bit of insight into this fantastically ancient medium. Cahill left to go to England. He'd had enough of Northern Ireland. He went to Cornwall. That company sort of folded. I picked up freelance contracts from the remnants of our clients and worked freelance for a few years, and then was persuaded to take a job with the BBC, and I was on their payroll for 2.5 years, and that's at the point where I quit the day job. By that stage I was making art in my free time and really trying to get an art career off the ground. So I gave up the day job in 1986, and I had all day, every day to make the work, and really things really began to take off at that point. And also it was my first opportunity to exhibit in America. 2 opportunities came up. Lucy Lippard came came to Ireland. She went right around Ireland selecting an exhibition of work that she was going to show in Canada and America. And I was included in that, which was a big thing for me at the time. And then I had an opportunity to show in a commercial gallery in New York in a group show. It was called the Dog Days of August, and it was a gallery had decided to keep their gallery open during August when most of them were closed, and just have a show of art that had references to dogs, images or references to dogs in it. And you know, that was, they sold work for much more than I could have got here, and I was delighted. I thought, this is great. You know, this is you know, in the year when I'd given up a regular income, several things happened. I won a GPA award for emerging artists, so you know, a bit of money was coming in. I also had the opportunity to do the Monkey Town Besieged by Dogs with John Carson was running the Grapevine Art Centre Gallery at the time in Dublin, and he invited me to do a show, and I came up with that. I had an old book of days from the 19th century, and there was an engraving in it of Mrs. Midnight and her animal comedians, and this woman trained animals to perform plays. She dressed them up in costumes, and one of these plays was A Monkey Town Besieged by Dogs, and there was an image of all these monkeys defending the battlements and dogs around the castle and going up ladders, and just something about it reminded me of the Siege of Derry. And once I followed that train of thought, you know, the dogs became Republicans and the monkeys became loyalists, and it just took off from there. I was just transposing all these scenes of sectarian division or differences into this monkey-dog world. A Monkey Town Besieged by Dogs was a sort of man as animal satire done in '85 and continued in '86. It was first shown in Dublin. Was shown in Belfast in the Crescent Arts Centre quite a few years ago. The sculptural piece of the monkey and dog in combat was made at a later date and is now in the collection of the Hugh Lane Gallery in Dublin. Along that wall are violent scenes of other kinds, and even looking at violence among animals, violence to oneself, violence to a moving statue in one of them. And I arrived in Dublin one time. I'd been away somewhere, and I just saw the headline in the Irish Times, "Man attacks moving statue." And it didn't explain, everybody in Ireland knew what a moving statue was, but somebody just getting off the boat or the plane must have wondered what is going on in this country. And if some kind of evangelistic guy attacked the moving statue, I think with an axe, possibly a hammer. But it was an opportunity to have an image of a man attacking a woman without it being Sam Peckinpah territory, and so there's a suggestion of misogyny as well as iconoclasm. I've always found it a very positive thing when you have a bit of time that is funded, where you've got a studio space, a stipend, you've somewhere to live, and you don't have to worry about all those overheads, and you can just concentrate on the work. The studio is dedicated to the work itself. It's not part of your home. You're not interrupted by domestic issues. And that's tremendously valuable. And I always said it was one of the best ways the Arts Council spent their money funding those fellowships. And there was one from the Republic as well as the North simultaneously. And it just opened up a whole lot of avenues for artists in New York. You would be there, anytime I would go there later on, I would always bump into somebody from Ireland, and it was usually had come about through that PS1 connection. But New York is interesting because it doesn't have, you know, you go to a museum in Italy, and you're in the country where those Etruscans lived, and the Romans and the Renaissance, and you can follow it right through. America just has the stuff, and it's a very, very in-your-face contemporary culture. And I guess that's how the Treasures of New York series occurred, because I was making antiquities for that culture. You know, just spoof mosaics made out of toasted cream crackers, and these taxi cab fragments decorated as if they were attic vases, frescoes based on the subway advertising. You know, I was using the language of the ancient world to depict contemporary Manhattan. We've been able to put together a nice little collection from a series called The Treasures of New York. Marianne was able to borrow works from the Irish Museum of Modern Art and the British Council and Fingal County Council. Most of that series of works are in public collections, which I'm very pleased about, and thankfully the owners of the works are very generous in their frequency of lending them. I spent a year in New York in a fellowship in '89-90 at a place called PS1, and after about 3 months living in the city, I started to make work that related to the experience of being there. And coming from Europe, I was immediately struck by this stark contrast between rich and poor, and just not what we think of as rich and poor, but just the filthy rich and the abjectly poor. I tried to pick up on things that Americans were concerned about. And one of those at the time was the fiasco of healthcare. And on one side of this piece, you have 4 doctors around one rich patient, and the other side 4 patients looking for the attention of one doctor. And I don't need to tell you which is the public sector. Scraping the surface is kind of self-explanatory. There's a law in New York that says you get fined several $100s if you let your dog on the pavement, but they don't have any laws to deal with all the other detritus that gets left lying around. The garbage can then, or bins, called coffee urn, is a parody of the New York coffee cup, which often carried images from ancient Greece. As did the financial world. They liked classical images to kind of reinforce their importance and longevity. And I made this mosaic of George Washington taken from the dollar bill. The little Masonic eye in his forehead comes from the other side of the banknote. And he's made in toasted cream crackers. The crackers are toasted to different darknesses and then laid as a mosaic. Just to play on that thing of the most ancient form of pictorial, ancient pictorial medium that we have in our civilization, just being made out of something insignificant. However, it's still here after 15 years. It's owned by Fingal County Council, and I hope it'll at least outlast me.
Now, you're best known for The Big Fish. How did that come about?
It was an open submission competition. Lagan side were commissioning a work for a site at Donegal Quay, just beside the Lagan Lookout. There was a very good firm of landscape architects, Camlin Lonsdale, who had designed all the landscaping around the waterfront hall, and they already had the commission to design that area. It was an old car park. There was nothing much down there. There was no community there. There was no housing, no very few buildings. So there wasn't, it wasn't like inheriting some kind of cultural territory. It was pretty much a clean sheet. And I worked quite closely. I won the commission with this proposal for the fish, and I wanted something that would something that would relate to the city, but also it was a time of great hope. It was coming up to the millennium. All the peace negotiations were going on. I can't remember the exact date of the Good Friday Agreement, but there was a great feeling of hope for the future. And what I discovered that the salmon were returning to the Lagan again to spawn. And ironically, the industrialisation that built Victorian Belfast was what had cleared them out of the river in the first place. So this happened to a lot of European rivers, that the pollution caused by industrialisation stopped the salmon from coming back. They had been coming back in increasing numbers, so I hit on that as a good symbol of regeneration. But then I wanted to incorporate the details of the history of the city into the fish, and came up with this technique of printing onto ceramic tiles and making tiles, custom making tiles to fit the shape of the fish. And ceramic fragments are the essence of archaeological discoveries from very early periods, because they last for such a long time and they carry little bits of history with them. So it was a perfect medium to tell a history, but not, as I say, it's not a didactic history lesson. It's something that everybody can discover a little bit that relates to them on the surface of it. The first thing I did was I hired a ceramics expert, a guy called Gus Mabelson, who used to teach pottery skills for the Crafts Council in Ireland. And I got him to test clay and glaze for me, and he put it through all these freeze-thaw tests and everything, just to make sure, to get what potters call glaze fit, to make sure the glaze and the clay match up perfectly, get the temperature right that you're firing to, so that it'll stand up to all weathers. But it's, I'm well pleased with the way it's held up.
Is there any secrets inside it? Anything you've...
There's a time capsule. Those smaller pieces in the gallery, I just got into a habit when I had a small piece of work and I was closing up the shell of it. You know, you make an armature and then cover it in plaster, reinforced plaster, but it's hollow in the middle. So before I closed it up, I would just get the day's newspaper and wrap it up in polythene, stick it in there, just for my own amusement. So we decided to do that kind of officially with this, and a lot of people were invited to contribute things to the time capsule. One idea I initially had about the structure of it, just the way the tiles are structured, was to those cracks that run through. It's based on the cracks that run through a bit of glazed pottery that has, you know, those little crazing, they call it. And I always thought they looked like maps, and I thought that would be a lovely thing to do it as a map of Belfast. But I thought, after I looked into that a bit further, I thought that's going to take me 2 years instead of 1 year.
Are there any images on it that particularly intrigued you when you were putting them on? You know,
I had a lump in my throat doing research done in the Lindenhull Library of images from the early days of the Troubles. And they're actually up, and the fish gets darker as you go up. It's light under the belly and dark on the top, so they're up in the dark end of it. Yeah. And just, you know, things like the Abercorn, the Donegal Street bombings, that all came back to me, just how horrendous that period was. But there are wee jokes in it as well, like the sea lice. You know, the salmon get these lice. Yeah. I think it affects the farmed salmon quite a bit, so we stuck a few of those on. I had a marine biologist send me down what do these things look like. I love the way the tail has gone. There was a blue patina that the foundry put on it, and they said, "Now this may not last. It's not as long lasting as green, that sort of City Hall verdigris, like almost the colour of this coat. That's the natural colour that bronze wants to go when it ages." But they put on the blue, and I said, "Well, let's start off with that, and then you know, it'll wear down. People will scratch things into it, and it's come up beautifully now." Somebody's put a biscuit or something in its mouth.
You use the same technique in the pulse shelter sculptor.
Yeah, that's much more whimsical. It's a waterfall of Irish souvenirs, and it's a tradition that has ended now, or people don't really go to for their holidays to Bangor anymore, or Portrush, but they're more likely to do a day trip. But there used to be a great tradition of souvenirs from different parts of Ireland. And I thought, well, that ties in that could tie in all the places the buses travel to. Of course, I wasn't able to get souvenirs from all these places, but we did make some tiles to fit in along with the commercial souvenirs. So it's covered in the usual leprechaun and harp and shamrock stuff. There's wee snippets. There's an RUC badge in there somewhere up. There's a U2 mug. Just wee bits and pieces that I came across are incorporated into it. And also people were invited to bring some souvenirs of their own to contribute to it. This is probably the most intimate space in the gallery. We've tried to make this into a little museum, because these are works that relate to the Museum of the Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly, which any of you who have had a sick child or have been a sick child might have seen in the Royal Victoria Children's Hospital. And it's an installation in some cases, like a little museum installation in glass cases in the main lobby. We didn't ask to borrow any of that work because, well, that might have been a problem, but also we didn't want to sort of take it away from its natural habitat. And I have quite a lot of work that I did in preparation for that, studies for subjects, ideas that I didn't follow through. I was trying out a lot of different things at that time. So there are little fresco studies of these chimney birds, which were like mummified jackdaws which came out of an old chimney. I just was trying to think of equivalents for the old lady's animals, and I wanted to make her real. She's from, I'm sure you all know the song, I Know an Old Lady Who Swallowed a Fly, and that was kind of hybridized with a collection that's in the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia. It's a medical museum where they have a cabinet full of things that people swallowed, and it's a delight. So it took off from those two things, and I made all the animals that the lady swallowed. And on that big poster, you'll see down the right-hand side is the sort of swallowing sequence, and all of those ceramic objects are in the Children's Hospital in cases. But there's another case that's dedicated to her stuff, and I worked with a lace maker, a silversmith, a knitwear designer, a potter, to make objects that might have belonged to the old lady. And there are a few things here. There's a design for spider lace, which I actually got a woman called Geraldine Clark, a lace maker, to create for the hospital installation. There's an amber necklace with mountings made by Mike McCrory. Nicholas Moss made a fly tea set for me. These are designs for fly wallpaper, spider, and fly fabric. And in the end, I decided to make all the animals for the hospital in ceramic, because it was like a kind of like a surreal china cabinet. I like this sort of subversive china cabinet that the lady might have had. And the old lady in the photograph was my old neighbour in Dublin, Doreen Foley, who was an inspiration for this work and other things. And she was game for anything. And she had no trouble posing with a fly in her tongue. It's not a real fly, though, thankfully. And she had these cupboards. I used to call it her antique food collection. She had jam going back to the 1950s, which was sort of like mummified jam. She had various foodstuffs with the pre-decimal prices still on them. And she lived to 92, 93 years today, without any harm coming to her. Down here, there's a little series of anatomical studies, but they're anatomical studies of things that don't have anatomy, or at least don't have skeletons. But I've just invented skeletons for a rabbit hot water bottle, a rubber duck, a little souvenir doll. And I don't know if this is Ireland's first musical print, but I've yet to see another one. And I'm not going to tell everybody about this, but these are dolls that are sold in Dublin to tourists. And when you press the leprechaun's waistcoat, he plays when Irish eyes are smiling, and the little device is under his rib cage here in the skeleton. I have a sublet studio which I'm using to sort of muck up an idea for an interior, a painted interior. I'm proposing it for a space in London, but I haven't got any confirmation that that's going to happen. And the working title is An English Interior. I'm using the work of William Hogarth, the engraving of William Hogarth and details from that, but also the work of Dudley D. Watkins, who was the creator of Desperate Dan, among others. And looking at those old Desperate Dan strips, I'm just amazed by the ingenuity of the compositions, and just the visual ideas are extraordinary. The stories are nonsensical, but the way he composes the thing is exquisite. And I'm trying to find a default style that will bridge that gap between Hogarth and Watkins. And I've created, it's sort of almost like early wallpaper. And I'm using a very restricted palette of indigo and ochres and umbers, and using big broad brush strokes, and creating these sort of chunky compositions that will fit into an architectural space. That way of you know, paintings on a canvas in a frame that are portable, that only really goes back about 500 years. But we've been making art for thousands of years, and art that is integral to an architectural space, it has been with us so much longer, and it's something architectural friezes, frescoes, screen paintings, altarpieces, all of those things I've always loved. You can manipulate someone's image considerably in a front view or a three-quarter view. You can change how someone looks dramatically by lighting it in different ways, but a profile is always a profile, and that's why police use them, and you know, they have other forensic uses. But I found working with sitters in that format, they take a different view of you to if you're looking at someone face on. They almost sit as if they're going through a medical procedure. They don't smile. They don't try. They're not shy. They're not coy. They just sit there as if they're having something performed by a doctor. I had the opportunity to propose a piece of work for Ballymun regeneration. Ballymun, for those of you who don't know Dublin, was a big housing estate on the outskirts, on the northern outskirts of the city. And it was synonymous with bad town planning, tower blocks, blasted heaths, and really sort of scruffy place. There was some street housing, but it was the flats, the tower blocks, that were really the problem. I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, they started to plan a new Ballymun to try and correct the sins of the past. And there's been a big program there, still ongoing, of regeneration, and they've commissioned quite a lot of artworks for the region. And I proposed some works for the civic offices, and it was a series of paintings of sisters, portraits of sisters. And I just made a request in the area for, if you lived in Ballymun and you had a sister and you were a sister, you could come forward, just turn up at a temporary photographic studio, have your picture taken. You would at least get a print. Everybody who participated got a print from the initial photographs. I then shortlisted 8 people and then whittled it down to 4 that I did on full-size carbonate portraits, like the ones that are outside there. These 2 were amazing, Croghan twins, and they were identical twins, but they got the same hairstyle, except they parted their hair on opposite sides, so they were like mirror images of each other. And it was a little bit like being in a Diane Arbus photograph when you were with them, but they were great fun. I think there's always something a little bit sinister about twins, but they were a great laugh. Before I did this, I was actually thinking about this idea of sisters, and just thinking about friends and people I knew who weren't exactly like each other, but you would spot them on the street. You would say, "There's a Nolan," or there's a Gilfillan. And these 2, Betty and Joan Gilfillan, are from Limavady, and they just have that. You would never mistake one for the other, but they do have that sort of. I don't know. I call it gene spotting, and I come back to Belfast and I see people that I think I recognise, but they're 30 years younger than the person I thought they looked like, and then I realise, well, that could be their son or daughter, and you know, the Ballymun thing grew out of that.
How difficult is it to be a full-time artist?
It's not as difficult as I make it. I could be a lot more successful commercially than I am if I didn't spend so much time in the lab, as I call it. I spend a lot of time experimenting, trying things out, going down into cul-de-sacs, coming out again and taking other directions. Most successful artists have got what could be called a signature style, where their work is instantly recognizable as a Louis Le Brocq or something. I mean, I suppose I have that in a way, but I've got a lot of different ones. People would recognize these mosaic pieces, they would recognize the taxi cab pieces, but these are not things I do any longer. You know, I've moved on from that. Commissioned work is a good source of income, but it's a difficult thing. It's a difficult thing to marry to an artistic agenda, because it's getting much more. It's becoming a kind of checklist of obligations that an artist has in making public work. I'd like to make art that can be understood at a certain level by a child, but also doesn't insult the intelligence of a critic. And sometimes it's difficult to fulfill the agendas that people who are commissioning work have, especially if a lot of different bodies are involved, like it might be Department of the Environment, roads people, city councils, property owners. There could be a lot of different agendas going on where an art commission is concerned, and sometimes that just ends up with mediocrity. And I think that's the worst thing can happen. I like really truly bad art, and of course I love really brilliant art. It's the big load of ordinary stuff in between that is debilitating.
It seems to me that John has the eye of a scavenger and also the eye of an archaeologist. He lays down stuff on car doors, cereal packets, slates, car bonnets. He makes mosaics, as in the famous iconic big fish, on which my own work is inscribed, actually, you know, and will probably be around for all time, because when the big fish itself, you know, falls apart, which, you know, it'll be a long time hence, I guess, the shards will still be lying around, and perhaps somebody in the 23rd century might find these shards and reassemble them again.
For his work. A lot of the work hasn't been shown here before in Belfast, so that's fantastic. The people of Belfast, where John's actually from, get to see the work firsthand and enjoy it, and they get to see the process and some of the mosaic pieces that they can identify with the fish and the Children's Hospital, and the museum of the old lady who swallowed a fly is here as well. My favourite, or the piece that would stand out for me most, or whatever way you want to put it, would probably be the sectarian armour from the Imperial War Museum. It was such a feat to get that piece here from an institution like that and to secure that loan, and that was John's. He felt that was the main triumph that I did in the exhibition, and the piece itself is so exquisite that it just gave, you know, a piece from 1994 with such power. It just moves you to look at it and to view it in the round, so it was really worthwhile.
John, I'd like to take you right back to growing up, but more particularly the influence your parents had.
It's well documented in a series called the Belfast Frescoes, and that was actually a great aid to my memory. When I was working on those, I remembered things I didn't know I remembered. I grew up in North Belfast, overlooking the waterworks. We lived in the ground floor flat in 18 Brookville Avenue, and you could see the Cave Hill looking across the pond. It was a great paradise for kids. This quiet period of time. It was quite a posh area, or genteel maybe is the better word. A lot of old ladies living around us. My dad worked in the shipyard, and my mother didn't work when we were young. She didn't go to work until my youngest brother went to start at school. So my mother was the big influence on us. She spent a lot of time with us, and she had a great knack of knowing what kids would like to do, places that she would take us that she knew we would enjoy. My dad was a sort of, the sort of classic absent father, like Robert Bly talks about that, about how industrialization separated fathers.
I first met this man, John Kynes, in 1966 in Barnageeha School at the folk classes there. We learned to play guitars and sing "Ain't No Use Sitting Wondering Why, Babe," and that kind of stuff, And we met girls as well. Then we embarked on a voyage of exploration in a place called Salisbury Streets, which was just an ordinary house in the street, but in the back room, strange goings-on went on. And it was a place where the blues got kind of scrambled up with Irish reels and jigs and English shanties and chorus songs and stuff like that. So that experience of being, aware of the various kind of influences that come into you from outside and from inside, that there is that idea that you can be those guys, that you don't have to be who you are, Protestant or Catholic or this or that you can exchange yourself for heroes, of some kind.
John's work's very important to Belfast because he comes from Belfast originally. He hadn't had an exhibition in the city for 15 years, so it was very important to bring home the work to the people. A 20-year retrospective, he was celebrating 20 years as a practicing artist, and from my experience before, I had organised a Deborah Brown Cast in Nature exhibition at the Waterfront Hall to complement Sheep on the Road outside. So there was a similar vein here, that we were complementing the Big Fish and his other public pieces in the city with a 20-year retrospective.
And their sons. He was out in the morning. I had no idea what he did. And in the frescoes, there's an image of this cigarette moving around, this disembodied, glowing cigarette moving around in the dark, and that was him getting ready to go out to work. And then we didn't see him again until the evening. But he would come home with things like the shavings of the metal embedded into the soles of his boots. He had maybe skelfs, as he called them, in his hands. My mother used to take out a wee bit of metal out of his finger, quite often. Handkerchiefs with rust spots on them. Just little clues as to this heavy metal environment that he inhabited. He was a driller. And I didn't ever see a shipyard until I was at secondary school, and our woodwork teacher took us down to see a launch, as he called it. And that was the first insight I had into my father's world, into his workplace. My mother's family they were very interesting. They had been photographers. There were 3 generations of photographers. Lascelles was her maiden name, and my uncle still practiced as a photographer. My grandfather died when I was quite young. I have only vague memories of him, but he seems to have been quite a character. And he was a humanist, and he was anti-vivisection and anti-inoculation, and they were the kind of radicals of their time. I'm going to take you on a quick tour around the exhibition, and things are not exactly in chronological order, but I'll try and put some kind of order into it. A lot of you will know a large piece of sculpture in Belfast, and it's probably what I'm best known for, so we thought it was a nice idea to have some sculpture as you come in the door, and particularly some of its antecedents, some early ceramic mosaic pieces they're kind of miniature versions of that type of sculpture. They're like the fish, but just on a domestic scale. They're constructed in the same way, but with plaster and steel rods rather than concrete and heavy-duty steel welding. The construction of these creatures
switch room within a stone's throw of the city. So it was just the perfect exhibition for a 7,000 square foot space that's been provided by Robinson McElwain. So you have that feeling of just an opportunity not to be missed, but you need a major name, you need an established artist who's a major player to really hold a space like this and bring it into its own. Every exhibition you need to be determined and dedicated and passionate about both the artist, the work and the venue. Now all those ingredients were there, but it took major personal commitment. If you're putting together any retrospective for a museum or a gallery, you need a 2-year lead-in period. To be giving it a 6-month lead-in period and fast-tracking it like that is probably quite, it's a bit of a gamble. So essentially what I did when I approached John in March was said to him, is this something that you think you can do? And he said, well, you have the vision, and I know John Reid well, so I would be interested in rising to the challenge, but you're going to need to do a lot of work. And he gave me that challenge early on, so I knew exactly what I was getting into. If we had had a number of touring venues to send John's exhibition to, everybody piggybacks on the funding, and they all work together in terms of production of catalogues and so on. That level wasn't there, and I suppose that was the major difficulty in the whole thing. We were both dedicated, John Kindness and I, but it did have that obstacle. So essentially what we did was we had to pare back a lot of elements, and we had to just use the switch room as the ultimate destination for the exhibition. And really all the shortfall in funding was met by the architects themselves. They put all their personal practice money into it to meet that obstacle. It was remarkable how thirsty people were for his work. To have an artist talk in the city attended by about 150 people is pretty much unprecedented even for festival times. The openings get the crowds, but the talks, that really thrilled me to see so many people thirsty.
It's great to have a retrospective exhibition of your work in your hometown while you're still alive. Earlier this year, I got a message from a curator I didn't know, Marianne O'Kane, who as you get a letter from somebody you don't know, and you glance down and you're scanning for sort of key words and phrases, and I saw the words major retrospective, and that sounded good, and then I saw the words this year, and I was ready to file it under N for Knitters when I saw the names Robinson McElwain and John Reid, and I knew John Reid wasn't a knitter, so I gave Marianne the benefit of the doubt, and I'm delighted I did, because not only is she totally sane, but she's a very determined, dedicated young woman who has put this together in record time, got loans from major collections, and all without funding from the sources one would expect. I'll not mention any names, but the sources one would expect to fund an exhibition of this sort are noticeably absent from the credits. And it was Marianne's faith and John and his partner's support that kept this going, and their faith that kept throughout the process. And I've said before that faith in a time of no funding is better than funding in a time of no faith. And we look forward to both in the future. Thank you very much for coming.